And there's the warning that it's telling me to be on my best behavior.
Mm-hmm. You're always on your best behavior.
I wasn't today.
Well, I couldn't tell, but I guess I wasn't there.
Eh, well, that's a whole thing. I'll tell you later.
Right. Shalom, Mara and Jade. I hope that even if this has not been the perfect week, that it gets a little bit better. Tonight might not be any more joyful, but um, I hope that we can have some some conversation that changes us tonight. Oh my goodness, which cat is that?
That is Mr. Whiskers.
That is Mr. Whiskers. I've heard so much about him.
He's my blue-eyed one. I don't know if you can tell.
No, his eyes do not look blue on
Oh, they
screen.
are like crystal blue.
Ah,
He's like a
um,
flame point or twin point or flame point Siamese.
hmm,
He's being needy because he had a conal null last week.
lovely, lovely. All right. Good evening, everybody. It's good to see you, or to at least see your names. Last time we talked a lot about healing and about death and about mourning. What we didn't get to though is Jewish perspectives on the afterlife. So I'm curious, before I give a little lecture on different ideas, what have you heard before about Jewish perspectives on the afterlife?
There isn't such a thing as hell?
That there isn't such a thing, or there is such a thing?
Oh, well, there isn't. Jews don't believe in hell,
There
but I
is
don't know how to
such
about
a
it.
thing as hell. Jews do not believe in hell. That is one perspective.
I've also heard some say they don't believe in heaven either.
Hmm. There is no heaven. Jews don't believe in heaven. That's another perspective. Kind of part of the same thing, but yes. All right. What's really telling is that people aren't jumping to give an answer, right? In Judaism,
Some
I'm going to give you my thesis about the afterlife in Judaism at the beginning and at the end, just so that we're clear. The reason why there are both so few and so many views on the afterlife in Judaism, so few people who talk about it and so many views, I think personally, is that there are is that we don't really know, and we can't really know what happens after we die, but what does matter, what does happen after we die, that we know, is that our actions and our words in this life have consequences on the lives of those around us, those who we love, who are going to be here way after we're gone. So our goal is to be living this life, not for the sake of where we're going to go in the future, because what does it really matter where I individually go, but how do my actions, how do my words affect my community and my loved ones? With that, I'm gonna present a couple of different views of the afterlife that are often believed in Judaism. Mark, did you have something else to share?
I mean, the only thing I would have mentioned is they believe more on like the soul, I think, is what I've heard people talking about. But that goes more with what you're saying about how you impact others.
Mm-hmm. So the soul is definitely something we talk about in Judaism. Um, and in our textbook, there's some really interesting quotes that you can find on page 221 if you've got your textbook. But I think we'll go straight into just talking about some of these concepts. I will read this first quote here from Mishnah Avot. And remember, Mishnah is written about 0 to 200 of the Common Era. The world is like an entrance hall before the world to come. Prepare in the entrance way so that you can go to the great hall. So this is a view on the afterlife that the afterlife itself means something significant. This is something that we do get in Judaism, in some streams of Judaism. There's this idea of Olam Haba, the world to come. Olam Haba is sometimes also called Gan Eden, which is the Garden of Eden. And Olam Haba can mean a whole bunch of different things. What I've heard is a commonly held way of looking at Olam Haba is that, page 219, sorry about that. What I've heard commonly about Olam Haba, about the world to come, is that in this world, the first stage that we have is we die, and then we go to kind of a middle place, right? A neutral place where we're judged. And we look over everything we've done in our life, and then we either stay there for a really, really, really long time, or we go immediately to Olam Haba, to the world to come, to the good place. There is not often a view of a hell sort of thing. The closest we have is that neutral place that's often called Gehenna. So some people will translate Gehenna as hell, but I've never actually heard it described in the same sort of burning fire and brimstone terms as we might see hell often in literature or in movies, right? It's not really a bad place. It's a waiting place. If we haven't done great things in our lives, we might be there for a really, 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 really long time. But eventually, once we've gone over our deeds and we've made atonement for everything that we've done, we'll eventually go to the good place, ideally. And there's no universal picture of what the good place is going to look like or how to get there. But in the Talmud, some of the visions that we see are of lots of people studying together. Some of the visions of the good place is that there's no halakha, there's no Jewish law needed in the good place because everybody's already just awesome and we don't need all the rules, right? We can all get together and we all know the right stuff to do without anybody telling us, right? It's just all good people all the time. Right? So that's the idea of the world to come, Olam Haba. And so some of our prayers, some of our morning prayers will talk about making sure that our loved ones are elevated to Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, the good place. So there is not really a bad place, although some people will interpret Gehenna as hell. And I'm sure there are modern commentaries that would explain Gehenna as more of a traditional hell-like notion, but I haven't really read that in traditional text. Some other notions are, I'm going to go to reincarnation next because to resurrection, Tchiyat HaMeitim next, because I think that's the most fun. I think it's the most ridiculous, but some people take it really, really seriously. So there's this idea that when we die, if we are buried in a halachic way, if we are great people, when we die, we're kind of waiting until, well, actually, we might even go to Olam Haba for a while. We might even go, our souls might even go somewhere else, but eventually, when the Messiah comes, we are all going to roll underground to Jerusalem, and then we're all going to spring up from the ground and party in Jerusalem together. It'll be really crowded and probably smelly, but we won't care because we're all partying in Jerusalem together. The Messiah has come. We're happy, right? That's the idea of Tchiyat HaMeitim, of resurrection, literally the living of the dead. And that's what's going to happen when the Messiah comes. The third temple is going to happen again. Lots of animal sacrifices again. It'll be great, right? I think it's a little ridiculous, but some people see it as their inspiration for doing good in the world. So that is inspiration for some people. So we've got resurrection, we've got this idea of the world to come, which is kind of an amalgamation of different ideas. Anyone you ask is going to describe that differently. I've also heard Olam Haba as synonymous with what the world's going to be once the Messiah comes. So Olam Haba can also refer to if we're all going to be resurrected, the world that we're all going to be resurrected into. So again, lots of different meanings for that. One other notion is Gilgul Hanishamot, or reincarnation. We didn't have time to go over the Sfirot yet, and in our class 19, in our class where we're going to go over lots of stuff we didn't get to, we'll go over the Sfirot. The Sfirot are this Kabbalistic idea that God embodies 10 different basic being, or 10 different basic attributes. And we've got judgment and compassion, we've got wisdom, there's a whole bunch of different attributes, kingship, etc. And the goal of life, according to this idea of Gilgul Hanishamot, is that each of us are to try to embody all of those 10 Sfirot as well as we possibly can. Now, that's not possible in one life, so the idea is that we get reincarnated again and again and again until we fulfill each of those 10 godly principles. And it's a similar notion as reincarnation in some Eastern traditions, right? That eventually we'll reach the nirvana of being godly, right? Or we'll go to Olam Haba, right? So some of these theories intertwine with one another. One of my favorite other theories is called, is based on souls, like someone had said before, maybe it was Mark had said before. So one of my favorite theories is that we as human beings are made up of multiple souls. So there are 3 basic souls with possibly some others, but the 3 basic souls are the Ruach, which is our emotional seat, the Nefesh, which is our embodied seat, and the Neshama, which is our godly or spiritual seat. Right? So in the Ruach is the part of us that experiences emotion and thought. Right? The Nefesh is the part of us that does stuff, right? We can't act as humans without our arms and our legs and our tongues and our ears and our eyes and our nose and our mouth. And even though not all of us have all of those features that are usable to us, we have a whole lot of body that we can use, right? And our body is a big part of us, as we talked about last week when we were talking about burial, right? So that's the Nefesh. And the Neshama is this idea that each of us has a spark of God in us. And each of our sparks are actually exactly the same, right? We each have that bit of godliness in us. So when we die, according to this soul theory, when we die, our Nefesh, our bodily soul, stays in the ground where we're buried with our bodies. Our emotional soul, our Ruach, kind of goes to Olam Haba, goes to the Gan Eden, goes to the good place with a whole lot of other souls. Right? And then our Neshama, our spark of godliness, kind of vanishes into the infinitude of godliness that is everywhere at all times. So goes back and joins God, right? But all 3 keep a connection. So when you visit somebody at the grave, or when you talk to someone who has died, when you make that connection with them, you can access any of those other souls. So a lot of times people will go to a loved one's grave, and through that grave, they feel a closer connection to God because that neshama is there. And then they can also communicate with other people. Let's say there's someone you don't know where their grave is, but let's say that you know that Aunt uh, Aunt Edith was close with your great grandfather, and you'd like to speak to your great grandfather but don't know where he is. You'll go to Aunt Edith's grave in order to connect to your great grandfather. So lots of ideas of the afterlife in Judaism. Questions, comments, concerns about about all of these afterlife ideas, or other theories that I haven't mentioned?
So, hi, my question is kind of like, I don't know if I'm going to phrase this. Are these all theories are held by different group people, or are they like options? Are they like, I don't like option, wrong word, but are they like theory that coexist in a singular person's belief system? Like, well, maybe this happens and maybe this happens. Is it a quest or a statement? Is my
Yeah, totally depends on who you ask. So certain groups, certain religious groups are going to ascribe to certain theories. And usually some combination of these different beliefs are going to coexist within those groups, right? I would imagine that there are some religious groups that that are going to believe that if you don't believe in resurrection of the dead, you're a heretic, right? Um, but but each religious group is going to hold a totally different opinion about this, right? Any rabbi that you ask from any denomination is going to give you a different answer about what happens after you die. So I don't know if that answered your question, but yes and. Great. And what I'll also say too is that different parts of Judaism think different things about who the Messiah is or what the Messiah is. And so that also affects how we think about what happens after we die. Great. Again, my big thought, right? I said every rabbi is going to think something different about what happens after we die. As much as I love the soul theory, I think that it's beautiful. It's a beautiful way of thinking about the afterlife. My big theory that I cannot stress enough is that I think it's fascinating that Judaism has so many theories about what happens after we die, because we can't really know. But we do know that what we do and say in this world affects the people around us, affects our community. And we do know that our goal is to bring us to a better world, right? Not so that we can all be resurrected and party together in Jerusalem, although, hey, that might happen and it might be fun and lovely and not stinky. But so that the people we love and the people they love after them and so on and so forth can be living in a world without war or hunger or famine. And I think I spoke about this in a Devar Torah recently, but why I think this is really, really important and maybe even significantly Jewish is because of our Jewish attachment to community rather than to the individual, right? I think it's important that we don't care about where we go, or not that we don't care, but that we're not attached to where we go after we die as individuals, because our deeds don't matter so much to or don't matter as much to us as individuals as they do to the world that we're affecting, right? We do good in the world not so that we can get to heaven or we can avoid going to hell. We do good in the world so that we create a better world for the people that we love, right? And I think that's very significant Jewishly, especially in the time since I've lived here, since I've moved to the South and learned a little bit more about the Christian traditions around. I didn't realize how significant that really was. I think also, along that same line, something that's significant in Judaism, and we may have talked about this with the high holidays, is this idea that although death does allow for atonement against the stuff, atonement for the stuff that we've done against God. If we haven't asked for forgiveness from the people around us, if we haven't done the work to fix the stuff that's problematic that we've done, our consequences still linger in the world, right? The people who live after us still have to deal with everything that we've gone through, right? There's no one who's going to, let's say, die for our sins, right? Our consequences live on. So I think looking at what happens after we die in a realistic way, it may be uplifting, it may be helpful on a personal level and an inspirational level to create a theology of what happens after we die. But personally, I think what's more important is paying attention to what happens to not just us as individuals, but us as a community after each one of us leaves the world. Great. Other questions, other reflections? That's my big soapbox for the day.
I'll say this: when I was a Christian, um, everything was about do this so you can go to heaven. Everything was about you have to do this so you can go to heaven. And now I'm just busy trying to do good. Like I'm not even thinking about an afterlife.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it shifts the way that we're thinking, right? Is
Yeah,
life about the now or about the is life about the now or the later? Is it life about me or is it about us?
In a similar sense, it was also a way you mentioned like dying for sins is kind of the central theme over there. That was also a cop out excuse where people could do bad things and they're like, oh, I'm automatically forgiven for it.
Mm-hmm. Right. And
You
there's,
know,
there is some cop out in that. Let's say that if I've eaten bacon cheeseburgers all of my life, um, there's this idea that when I die, God's gonna wipe all that away. It might take some time. We might be in that waiting period for a while, but God will wipe all that out. For Yom Kippur and death atone for those kinds of things, but it's the stuff between people, between human beings, that doesn't get atoned for unless we actually do something about it. Thank you all. So we spoke about death, about mourning, about healing last week. Oh, the eternal lobby. The back rooms. Yeah, it is the eternal lobby. All right. We are going to move on to a topic that's not really or that's certainly not any more uplifting. Um, we're going to talk now today about um, anti-Semitism and the Shoah or the Holocaust. I'm curious if anybody this week or recently had time to watch a documentary or read a book, read a memoir relating to the Holocaust or relating to the Shoah.
I didn't read a physical book other than, remembering some of the stuff from school, but there was a movie that had popped up on my Prime list called The Pianist,
Mm. Mm-hmm.
the one where they're kind of showing the separation and the viewpoints and how it was basically all like even the good ones were corrupt in a way.
Yeah. How so? How even the good ones, meaning who or how?
Well, some of the characters in it, like you had your main character that was kind of like for the longest time helping with the Jewish communities, while they were being not allowed to go into certain restaurants or some certain areas, or shop in certain places. There's a central character that was kind of able, because of his connections, was able to pass through to the non-Jewish world and get things. But even even he had his price. Like when things started getting really bad, and trying to save his skin and save everyone's skin, it was like, everyone for themselves at that point.
Mhm. Right.
Um,
In a lot of memoirs, we hear about people's embarrassment over what were the things that they did to survive during that time.
There was another book that was a little historical. Well, not really historical. It's more of a fiction, but um, it was talking about in a similar sense. Oh, I'm gonna have to go look at the author, but she does some books with controversial themes and has you really try to think about it. But she was doing one called, it's called The Storyteller.
Hmm.
It was where this guy had been involved with the Nazi Party and doing very bad things, but he wound up kind of escaping all of that and being in America for many, many years, changed his identity, was the most beloved teacher, taught German in school, um, biggest activist in the community. Um, Nobody knew anything about his past or any story because he completely reinvented himself. But then at the end, right before dying, he was seeking forgiveness but it had to be from a Jewish person in which they were a direct ascendant of someone that he harmed many years ago. And there was this controversial issue on, it didn't happen to me, but you did a horrible thing. How do I forgive you for this?
Right. Right.
Or
That
do I?
right. And I believe also the pianist was took place in Warsaw. I think he was living in the
Yes.
Warsaw ghetto for most of his story, I think. And a lot of times hiding out in places where in places while while a lot of Warsaw was being deported, he spent a lot of his time hiding out and eventually being in that abandoned ghetto.
Yeah, because at the beginning it was because of his talent, he was able to kind of bypass and be the entertainment for everyone. So it kind of had, I don't know that you'd call it the best of both worlds, but for a while it was easier before, things weren't easy.
And Emma, did you have something you were going to say?
I mean, I was just going to say choiceless choices kind of thing, because the one I picked was when I unwisely started listening to whilst driving down to New Orleans an audiobook called Our Crime Was Being Jewish, which is just a collection of the fragmented stories of Holocaust survivors. Um, they're the ones that Netflix wouldn't dare put on show. I mean, there was one really horrible, and they're so horrible because they're fragmented. So these are things that came up in the trials. There was young woman who gave birth in the ghetto called Ruth Elias, and Mengele immediately told her to bind her breasts and banned her from breastfeeding her baby girl. And she was so terrified because she knew, too terrified to unbind her breasts. And her baby girl started to starve over the days. And she was only, some of the other women, they stole some dresses that she tore up and she used it to wrap some bread and soup. And that's what she gave a baby girl. But the cries got quieter. And then Mengele came in and told her, next day you're going on the train, which she knew meant Auschwitz. She knew she was going to die. And then one of the Czech doctors, who wasn't Jewish but was a prisoner, came round and when asked her why she was crying so much, and she told her the story. And sorry to traumatize other people, but I remember this verbatim, and this was completely dryly told. And she, when she told the story, apparently the Czech doctor just very calmly said, "I must save you," and came back with a needle of morphine and told her to inject her baby. And she said, this, I must save you, whenever she asked why. And she said she wouldn't do it because of the Hippocratic Oath. And eventually the woman did it. And when Mengele came around and found out the baby was dead and wanted to find the body, he then said, "You're lucky." you're not going on the train.
Mm.
So she killed her baby because it was the only way, which was, yeah, I do not recommend this as like a casual read because it's pretty awful.
What was
Yeah.
it called again?
Our crime was being Jewish.
Hmm.
It's like, I mean, I have personally, my great grandmother Ursula, the last time she saw her parents, she was 14 years old on the kinder transport, watching them go away on the platform. Like, there are plaques of the murdered family members I have. So obviously, I've been told about the Holocaust from a very young age. So that's why I kind of blindly wandered in, going, I am pretty aware of the horror that happened and the human skin lamps. Didn't know that people wore human skin gloves with nipples. That was from one of the flight attendants who was on the flight with one of the awful women who was going to go to trial. She was wearing human skin gloves with a human nipple visible. There's no embellishment in these stories. It is just flatly like, what people would say in a trial. Like, yeah, she didn't like embellish, just went, you don't know what to think about people like that.
And a lot of times what I find, and the reason why I recommended to read something or to watch something that you hadn't before, is at least I find that every single time I see a new documentary, or I read a new book, or I listen to somebody's testimony, I am surprised or shocked about something else, right? And it sounds like with Emma, for you, it sounds like this time with this particular testimony, it was that graphic shock of the stuff that was done, right? The graphic stuff that was done, either to people or by people. For Mark, it sounds like just the historical situation was something that maybe you hadn't thought about a whole lot before.
Well, I remember my first introduction to it at all was third grade reading Diary of Anne Frank for one of our readings.
Mm-hmm.
And even then, I had a hard time fathoming like why it was so awful.
Right, right. Right, because again, every time we hear one of those stories, it's a fragmented bit of story because there were so many experiences, right? We had 11 million people die in the Shoah, 7 million Jews, and 4 million who were either Roma or LGBTQ or had disabilities or were political prisoners. And this isn't counting the number of people who died in World War II. Right? These are the number of people who died in the Shoah. So I'm curious, did anybody else have a chance to read or to watch something in the past week or recently? And if so, what was something that surprised you or that interested you?
Drawn from the last time I was in the intro to Judaism class, there was one story that stuck with me, and I can't remember this lady's last name, but her first name was Margaret. And I think they had escaped to Paris, and they thought that they were fine, but somebody turned them in, and she was separated from her mother. Her mother, forget how old she was, but she was 18 herself. But they eventually got away. They were freed. And she said there was this woman waving to her. And she didn't know who she was, so she didn't wave back. But as she got closer, she realized that it was her mother. And they had gone through so much that she didn't recognize her mother. She had lost so much weight. She was just unrecognizable to her. And that's, for some reason, that story just is one of many that just sticks out to me.
Right, the little glimmers of hope,
Yes.
little glimmers of reunification. And I think this time around, what I read also kind of brought some of that. We hear these terrible, terrible stories, and the story that I read was terrible also, but it was a side of history that I hadn't heard much of. So I read. I don't know if I would recommend the book. The content is interesting. I don't love the writing, but Afterlight in Search of Poetry, History, and Home. It's written by Isa Millman, and she's a poet, and her mother was a Holocaust survivor. Isa Millman um, was actually born in a DP camp in Germany, but spent most of her life in the States and Canada, United States and Canada. And she tells her mother's story and her own story of going to visit different parts of Poland and Ukraine where her mother and her father grew up. They actually met before the Holocaust and went through everything together. But the part of the story that I hadn't heard before was that um, although although Russia was not a safe place for Jews at the very beginning of World War II, once Russia broke off with Nazi Germany, broke off their alliance with Nazi Germany, um, they actually a lot of the Jews that were in concentration camps or that were in prisoner of war camps, and in this particular story, the family was in Siberia, in a camp. A lot of them um, were actually evacuated with other Russians. Thousands and thousands and thousands were evacuated to the complete other side of the world, where they didn't have to go through what their family members were going through at the same time in Poland and Ukraine, in Hungary, right? Um, and so this story was a side of it that I hadn't heard before, that it was really difficult initially in that camp in Siberia. It was really difficult finding their way when they were being deported. It was really difficult in Poland before they got to that camp, but it's this story of kind of a fluke of Russian politics, of USSR politics, Soviet politics, that actually saved a whole bunch of different lives of people who might have otherwise been sent to death camps. So I hadn't thought of that. Right. I think also what I loved about this book is that it talked about, I think a lot of books about the Shoah start at the Shoah and then go on from there and talk about the destruction. And that's a lot about how the Holocaust has been taught. When you go to Holocaust museums, it often starts with anti-Semitism, right, and then goes on. But I think one part of the story that's really important is the context behind it, that maybe even makes the story more tragic if that's even possible. But that in Germany, in Poland, in other parts of Europe before World War II, Jews had a thriving cultural tradition, right? Jews were culturally diverse, had different strands of Judaism. I mean, denominationalism started in Germany. Jews were intellectuals and artists and farmers and, every sort of career path. They were a huge part of the population in Warsaw and in Berlin. And so what I appreciated about this book that I read was it talking about this author's aunt as a poet. And so I always look for those books that start beforehand, that talk about the lives of the people who lived in them, the lives of the survivors before the war as well, to give that context of what not just that that so many Jews died, but what they contributed to society before that. Great. From either Jade or Mara or Anna, any reflections or anything that questions, anything that's come up for you when you've read about or learned about the Shoah in the past? All right.
I mean, I think the thing that it's not real, it's kind of more of a reflection than anything else, but the thing that always just kind of gets about it is that to this day, the Jewish population hasn't been like replenished to pre-Shoah levels. I don't know if replenished is the right word, but like there's just such a huge portion of like our history and our people that were just wiped out, and it's like to this day the effects on the Jewish population are alive, even though at this point it was 80 years ago.
Right. Right. We're not even close in number. Absolutely. I'm going to show a video. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the history that led up to the Shoah, some of the history of anti-Semitism in general, because we know that anti-Semitism is not anywhere close to done, unfortunately. But what I'd like to, what I want to say before the video, though, is that I have a sort of pet peeve of videos that dramatize through music and through tone of voice. I'm very sensitive to that. So I think the information in this video is really important and is a great summary of the history of anti-Semitism. I'm not a fan of the tone that they use. So just take that as it is, and we're going to go over some of the things that we talk about in this video. It's quite long. It's about 13 minutes, but jot down any questions or reflections you have during the video so that we can touch on them afterwards. And let me know if there's any issue with audio.
Between 1939 and 1945, the Nazis killed about 6 million Jews and millions of other civilians throughout Europe. These are some who were slaughtered in the Holocaust. A generation lost forever. Jews are the people of the Hebrew Bible who lived in a land now known as Israel. They believe that there is only one God. Christianity emerged from Judaism. Jesus of Nazareth was a Jew who preached a singular religious message. The first Christians were Jews who prayed in Hebrew and observed the customs and religious rituals of Judaism. The Last Supper was a Jewish religious meal, probably at Passover. Jesus was put to death at the hands of Roman authorities under Pontius Pilate in Judea, but the gospel accounts were interpreted as blaming all Jews for the crucifixion. To his followers, Jesus was the Christ, the Messiah, his death, sacrificial atonement. Most Jews believed the Messiah had not yet come. Redemption was not at hand. Soon after the crucifixion, Roman armies destroyed the temple in Jerusalem. Jews were exiled and scattered to live as a dispersed minority. By the 5th century, Christianity had become the dominant religion in the Roman Empire. The early Christian church portrayed Jews as unwilling to accept the word of God. Illuminations showed Satan binding the eyes of the Jews. Some church leaders intensified the charge, condemning Jews as agents of the devil and murderers of God. The accusation was not renounced until the 1960s, when the Second Vatican Council officially repudiated the ancient charge that Jews had murdered Christ. For centuries, state and church laws restricted Jews, preventing them from owning land and banned holding public office. Guilds excluded Jews from most occupations, forcing them into pursuits like moneylending, trade, commerce. Excluded from Christian society, Jews maintained their religious and social customs. In 1095, Pope Urban II called for the liberation of Jerusalem. Christian crusaders set off to free the Holy Land from the Muslims. On the way, they slaughtered thousands of Jews. Throughout the Middle Ages, Christians persecuted Jews. Portrayed as alien, Jews were regarded as usurers. It was said Jews poisoned the wells of Europe, causing the Black Plague. Illustrations depicted Jews as the devil, with horns and cloven feet, and showed them using the blood of Christian children in ritual sacrifices. These lies came to be taken as truth. But where they were needed, Jews were tolerated. When they were allowed to participate in the larger society, Jews thrived. In many places, secular and religious states forced Jews into segregated districts later called ghettos. England, France, Spain, Portugal, and many German states expelled masses of Jews, most of whom migrated eastward, taking with them their religious convictions and traditions. In 1517, Martin Luther attacked the Pope and corruption within his own Roman Catholic Church, beginning the Protestant Reformation. The young Luther hoped that tolerance would persuade Jews to convert. But when Jews adhered to their own religious beliefs and refused to join his new Reformed Church, Luther's disappointment turned to hatred. What then shall we Christians do with this rejected and condemned people, the Jews? Their synagogues should be set on fire, and what does not burn must be covered over with earth, so that no man will ever see stone or cinder of them again. Their houses also should be razed and destroyed. All their prayer books should be taken from them. The Protestant Reformation brought no end to the anti-Jewish tradition of Christianity. With the 18th century Enlightenment's emphasis on reason, the domination of the Church diminished. Some Enlightenment thinkers called for full rights for Jews, but only on the condition that they discard their religious customs. Others blamed Judaism as the source of irrational religious faith. Even though many Jews assimilated socially and culturally, prejudice did not disappear. In France in 1894, Captain Alfred Dreyfus, the only Jewish member of the French Army's general staff, was convicted of passing military secrets to Germany. Later, proof of forgery confirmed his innocence, but Dreyfus remained the victim of a cover-up to divert attention from army corruption. A century after the French Revolution proclaimed liberty, equality, and fraternity, giving Jews their freedom, frenzied mobs in the streets of Paris chanted, "Death to the Jews." Religious discrimination had gradually changed into a thriving secular, political, and social anti-Semitism. Nevertheless, freed from some restrictions, many Jews entered the Christian world and became prominent citizens. Then, around 1900, a new lie was promoted, that Jews conspired to dominate the world using their money and intelligence to manipulate trusting Christians. Russian secret police forged a document to support the story of a takeover plot supposedly authored by a conference of Jewish leaders. A proven forgery, the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, was nevertheless translated into every major language and distributed worldwide. It is circulated even today, despite indisputable proof that it is a fake. To divert popular discontent at appalling living conditions and autocratic control, Russian authorities encouraged anti-Semitic violence. Jews were blamed for the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881. Pogroms, murderous rampages against Jews, erupted in Russia many times during the next 3 decades. The second half of the 19th century saw the emergence of yet another kind of anti-Semitism. At its core was the theory that Jews were not merely a religious group, but a separate race, Semites, set apart because of genetically inherited characteristics. Anti-Semites believed racial characteristics could not be overcome by assimilation or even conversion. Jews were said to be dangerous and threatening because of their, quote, Jewish blood. Anti-Semitic racism united pseudo-scientific theories with centuries-old anti-Jewish stereotypes. These ideas gained wide acceptance. The devastation of World War I, the demeaning peace of Versailles, the hyperinflation of the 1920s and the Depression of 1929 fueled mass discontent. The presence of Jews in German cultural, economic, and political life made them convenient scapegoats for Germany's misfortunes. Enter Adolf Hitler. Hitler viewed world history as a racial struggle for survival of the fittest. He saw Jews as the source of all evil: disease, social injustice, cultural decline, capitalism, and all forms of Marxism, especially communism. Anti-Semitism would become the predominant ideology of the Third Reich.
Einen Kampfziel erhoben, geloblich diese Erscheinung aus dem deutschen Leben
Nazi racism victimized many groups of people, but it was against the Jews that the Nazi state mobilized all its resources for terror. After the Nazi takeover of power, anti-Jewish measures were put into effect one after another. Jewish businesses were boycotted, then seized. Jews were defined, separated from non-Jews. Jews were excluded from professions and studies. Jewish children were barred from schools. Jews were subjected to public humiliation. The changes, whether gradual or sudden, were incomprehensible. Few could imagine what would happen, even Jews. The Nazis took anti-Semitism to an unprecedented level of violence. Genocide, the systematic murder of millions of people deemed inferior. Six million Jews. These are some of them.
I'm curious. I'll ask this again in just a couple of minutes, but I'm curious what in there is new information for you, what gives you pause, what you might have questions about. I'm going to present a little bit more history and then we'll get to that discussion. This presentation, that video, touched on really 3 out of these 4, or 2 out of these 4 ideas of anti-Semitism. There was actually really 3. It touched on the religious anti-Semitism. In that video, because it was speaking about the history of European anti-Semitism, it did not talk about Muslim countries, which we'll cover in about a minute. Political anti-Semitism was a big thing, especially keeping in mind that in Europe, a whole lot of Jews were active in socialism. So that's something that we didn't really hear about here, but interesting to keep in mind. And then that racial anti-Semitism that came about in the late 19th century, when Darwinism became a big scientific idea. It evolved into social Darwinism, and this idea that certain races were genetically fitter than others, and therefore those others should be eliminated to make room for the superior races. Okay. Well, just looking at time, maybe we'll come back to this, but 3 examples of biblical anti-Semitism, or biblical, we wouldn't even say anti-Semitism, biblical anti-Jewishness or anti-Hebrewness, are Pharaoh, right? Who Pharaoh says, "Look, the Israelites are growing too numerous for us. Let us deal shrewdly with them so that they may not increase. Otherwise, in the event of war, they might rise up and join our enemies." Right? So Pharaoh is trying to limit the number of Jews who have power in Egypt, knowing that just a few centuries earlier we had Joseph, who was the second in command in Egypt. Right? So a similar situation, perhaps, as Germany before the 1940s, where there were lots of Jews in public political positions. Right? We had Haman as well. Right? Haman in the story of Esther. There's a certain people scattered and dispersed among us whose laws are different than those of any other people and who do not obey the king, and it is not in your majesty's interest to tolerate them. Keeping in mind that this statement is paired with an ask to the king that is granted for the Jews to all be murdered on a certain date. Right? We celebrate Purim on that date because it didn't end up happening because of Esther and Mordecai. That's another story. And Antiochus, who writes to his whole kingdom that all should be one people, all should give up their customs, and to not follow any of the Jewish customs anymore. Right? And each of these, along with each of these incidences, we have a Jewish holiday. So an interesting question, why might we have Jewish holidays to celebrate overcoming each of these incidences? Really interesting question. Hopefully we'll have a few minutes at the end to come back to this. The video spoke quite a bit about the religious anti-Semitism under Christianity. What we didn't talk about so much in the video was religious anti-Semitism under Islam. So under Islam, we actually had a much, much easier time historically, at least in the 1940s and earlier, right? At least before the State of Israel was in existence, we had a much easier time as Jews in Muslim lands than we did in Christian lands. The Pact of Umar in the 17th century, the Common Era, which is when Islam started, basically said that that there are different social statuses, right? Muslims had the highest social status. The next down on the social status are Jews and Christians and Zoroastrians, people of the book. And then the next down are people who are heretics, or whatever their equivalent of that is, right? They were the ones who were truly persecuted, but Jews and Christians had to pay an extra poll tax, identifying clothing, and had different rights that weren't had different rights, not the same as Muslims did, but they also held positions of power. Jews and Christians held positions of power. They were able to own their own property and to work the same jobs as everyone else. Overall, they fared a whole lot better under Islamic rule than under Christian rule throughout most of history. The video also spoke a little bit about that political anti-Semitism, right? Enlightenment and emancipation. There was this era of nationalism. We learned a lot about this in music history in college, right? Of the late 19th century, where everyone in Europe at least was celebrating their own nationalism of their own country, and it didn't really matter what religious background you came from, but you should be secular, right? Or you should be either whatever the religious tradition is in the area, or secular. And if you practice that way, then great, you can be a part of society, right? And so that's kind of what happened in France, right? You're allowed to be equal citizens, just don't be Jewish, right? At the same time, there was a whole lot of scapegoating, right? Showing how Jews were disloyal citizens, had disproportionate control of the media and finance. What the video didn't touch on all that much is that they had a disproportional control of media, or they had what was thought of as disproportionate control because those were some of the only jobs they were allowed to have, were in the arts and in finance. So lots of conspiracy theories there. Spoke a little bit about racial anti-Semitism, and the Shoah is an outgrowth of that. And in the video, they spoke a little bit about this timeline of the Holocaust. These are really the years, the big years, right? Hitler becomes chancellor in 1933. In the same year, book burnings begin. The Nuremberg race laws, which are, limiting where Jews can go to school. This is just in Germany, where Jews can go to school, what jobs we can have, swimming pools, things like that. 1935, the Gypsies or Roma began to be deported in 1936. Kristallnacht, which is this nationwide pogrom, is in 1938, not just nationwide, but state-sponsored. Then World War II begins in 1939, and we don't often think about how quickly everything happens after that, right? Auschwitz is established in 1940, in 1940, but it isn't until 1942 that at the Wannsee Conference, there's that recommendation of the final solution of really killing all of the Jews who are in Europe. And meanwhile, in 1941, in Ukraine, which is a different political situation than Germany, but in Ukraine, you've got 34,000 Jews shot into one mass grave. In 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, deportation of the Jews of Hungary. Keep in mind that in 1944, the Jews were deported in Hungary. This is 1 year before the war is over, and today there are barely any Jews left in Hungary. So the vast, vast majority of Jews in Hungary were murdered within that 1 year. So this is thousands and thousands and thousands of people in 1 year. I think more than thousands of people. So this is the rough timeline, although a whole lot of other things happened in the process. That's a lot of information to throw at everybody very quickly, a lot of which many of you already knew. So my big question with all of this is there anything that you didn't know in this, or that surprised you? Or is there anything you think is important to add that we didn't address in this history of anti-Semitism?
Nothing surprised me. I thought the video did a good job of going back to biblical times and tying it all in together. And you see how it led to things that happened then, and unfortunately are conspiracy theories still going on to this day.
Right. Jewish lasers are not a new idea, even though the object is different.
I would say it overemphasized the role of religious hatred, because if you look at other genocides like the Rwandan genocide, there are 10 definitive steps, and it's more a basis of settling feuds, was what the conclusion is, because it was not a religious thing, it was a racial and tribal thing. And that's very, Zimbabwe, the whole reason the Brits got involved was the Tutsis and stuff, and then the Brits were trying to defend some people who then, when they forced themselves freedom, they then went after their persecutors because they had been persecuted, so they were then just as bad. But
right. But I would say also with that is that the Rwandan genocide is also quite modern in the age that people think about race and tribalism, whereas when we're talking about early Christianity, or not even that early Christianity, Roman Christianity or European Christianity, before the modern era, there wasn't that language of race. And so in a sense, even though the church was talking about it in religious terms, really it was still that kind of tribalism. I think you're right that it was a grasping for power by groups, right? By groups with a good amount of power, especially groups with a lot of power who wanted to make sure that they stayed with a lot of power, right? Or who wanted to, especially in times of crisis, during the Black Plague, like, he didn't want people to get mad at God, so there are other people who we can talk, who we can blame. I think that you're right in that the religious and the tribalism is not really all that distinct. It just happens in different forms throughout history.
Well, I'll tell you an interesting neurological study they did. So they had several people who had very specific brain damage, to the point that their bodies would do like Tourette syndrome, random things that made no sense because they had no impulse control. So they'd pick up a pen. But if you turn around and ask these people, like, why have you got this pen? Instead of just telling you, I don't know, they would bend themselves and contort themselves to come up with some explanation of why they had this pen. Which is just what I'm saying. Like, a lot of this is very Nietzschean of, I need to explain why I'm doing this terrible thing to justify it. People can't do things without having a reason why.
Right. There's a whole lot in all of that, and I'm sure there's a whole lot more in that history of anti-Semitism. And of course, there's a whole lot more in the history of anti-Semitism from 1945 until now. Right? We've experienced some of it just in the past few years. And it looks different in every part of the world right now. But what I'd like to do now is step back from facts and history and talk a little bit about our personal experience. We each grew up in a different, with a different background in a different location. Some of us in a totally different country, others of us in different parts of the country, right? Some of us here grew up Jewish. Some of us discovered Judaism a little bit later. And so I'm curious for us to answer a few questions. I'm going to try to break us up into some groups and see how many people are able to participate. I'm going to try to break us up into two different groups, and together I'd like for us to answer some of these questions. In our groups, we'll answer some of these questions. They are in our textbook as well, so if you have a textbook, it might be helpful for one person from each group to have a textbook, just so that somebody has those questions. And I was planning on giving us more time, but let's start out with 5 minutes and see how we do. I'll break us into 2 different groups. We'll answer these questions together or in our separate groups, making sure everybody has time to talk, everyone who's able to has time to talk. And then afterwards, I'm going to ask for each person to share something that was interesting that somebody else said. If there's something in the group that you don't want to be shared, then let your group members know that as well. So I'll attempt to put us all in breakout groups, and I'll try to put us in groups so that everyone who's been talking today has an ability to be in, or a couple of you at least can be in groups together. So give me 1 second to put these together. All right. And I'll open the rooms and I'll jump back and forth between them and give us about 5 minutes. Hello again. Curtis, one thing that is a constant in each of these meetings is that I am terrible at actually ending at 8:30, but very tolerant of people leaving at 8:30 if they have to. You're muted though.
Yeah, no, I'm here for the duration. It's fine. It's fine.
I think we're still waiting for. Oh, they're back. They are here. Hello, I was just telling Curtis that the one constant to this class is that I am terrible at ending at 8:30, but totally understanding of anybody who actually has to leave at 8:30. But I'm curious. I got the beginning of the conversation between in room 1 and kind of the end of the conversation in room 2. I'd love for. I think we have a few enough number of people who, if Mara, you can answer. If Mara can answer in chat, and then everyone else, I'd love to hear. Is there something that is there something that you heard from someone else in the room that really struck you? That surprised
So
or
I was talking to Mark. Mark is somebody who grew up not Jewish. So Mark is somebody who has a completely different experience with Judaism than I do. And it was fascinating because he was telling me about how growing in a small town in Louisiana, people who were Jewish uh, were, at least some people who were Jewish, were scared of being outed as Jewish, were scared of being perceived as Jewish, people knowing that that's were. And that just kind of struck me because I was mentioning my own background. Like I was quote unquote born Jewish, and I've always been in communities with a relatively large Jewish population. And even though like intellectually I know that Jewish people are a very small segment of the population, I never really thought about what kind of means in modern day America. Like, what is the experience? And Mark wasn't talking about his own experience because he didn't grow Jewish, but the experience of people he knew. Like, what is the experience of somebody growing up as a Jewish person in a very non-Jewish environment? That was interesting for me to hear about.
Specifically on that, I was mentioning that growing up, I didn't know of anyone immediately. My only source was like watching cartoons and it being brought in. Well, I found out by accident. I saw something on the French teacher's desk and realized, oh, you're Jewish. And I said it like that, and she immediately, like, her expression immediately got like terrified, like looking around, like, you know, even though it was just myself and her in the classroom, she immediately panicked, like, who overheard you? What did you hear? And she goes, that's just information for you and I to know. Like, you don't go advertising it around that school or anywhere. But what I found interesting is when I started going to temple and there, her husband was actually one of, for like several years, he was the president of the board. And, here he is, like something like a role, a leadership role, and he was a professor at the college, but she's terrified to let anyone know of their status. So,
right. And I've heard that even in Northwest Louisiana or North Louisiana, because Monroe's North Louisiana, not so west, um, that every every city that you're in, it's the attitude towards Jews is different, or every part of the city that you're from. the attitude is different. So in Shreveport, at least talking to the kids, in Shreveport, I've got a lot of kids who, their friends are confused at them being Jewish and have lots of questions, but not so much hostile. Whereas students who are in Bossier and Benton, which is north of us, the farther north you go, and this is only like 30 miles, 20, 30 miles, north of us, there are students and teachers who have been very hostile to the Jewish students, to the extent of a student of mine's math teacher commenting on the first day of school that all of the Jews should have died in the gas chambers, right? And so every single student who comes to religious school, I found, because they're all coming from different areas of the region, every student who comes to religious school has a different experience with their Judaism, and especially because at our religious school and in our Jewish community, we try to get the kids comfortable with expressing their Judaism wherever they go.
Now, there was one example that I had forgotten about. So you've met my sister Brianna. Her little sister, they both went to a private Catholic school, just smaller classes things. She actually had trouble with the religious teacher there, like calling her out, trying to write her up, various other things, because she wouldn't take place in certain prayers, or certain rituals, or even kneeling for prayer. She wouldn't do it. And when he asked, why, she said, because I'm Jewish, and that's just not, how I was raised or my belief system. And I mean, it turned into an ugly show. Basically, the only way to get them to not make it a deal was the Catholic father basically had to give a large donation to the school to make it go away and to make the guy leave her alone.
Right.
But
And that's similar to what has happened in public schools, various public schools in the area, because a lot of the public schools around here, especially Bossier and Benton, do require their students to be engaged in prayer, and some of those schools have had to go through lawsuits because of the parents of Jewish and Muslim and students from other religious traditions, who
really,
kids don't want to or are not able to participate in that prayer. It's been an issue, especially north of Shreveport.
well, that's interesting, because at home they do silent prayer.
Mm.
And they don't force you to do anything specific. Their way of accommodating it before announcements is, we're going to do a little bit of a silent prayer. If you choose to do it, you can, but you don't have to do what someone else does.
Right. So I'm curious to hear from Curtis and Emma, because you had some good conversations.
The one thing that I was just fascinating, I've really never thought about, but it's very hard for me to hide if someone is being racist towards me, for being an African American or Black man. I can't take that away. I can't hide that. But it's very easy for me to hide my Judaism. So and I'm hearing, some of you guys talk that you can't. It's just the opposite. You can't hide your being Jewish. It's a bit more difficult, and it's just fascinating to hear, you guys speak about that.
Yeah, I mean, I just found it very, because I've never heard. I had one Arabic friend who kept saying the Jew thing, and the Jew comment you made, like being a Jew about things. I confronted her once, and she looked absolutely mortified, like the idea that it was anti-Semitic had never occurred to her, literally, because she knew I was Jewish. It was kind of, and I genuinely believe she had no idea. But you remind me, that's my only encounter. But then I feel like it was just, she was like using like some kids use the word gay, as an insult. It was more like she didn't even understand what she was doing. It was just muscle memory. But yeah, I've never, found it interesting you being that thing of being a Jew about Price and stuff, because I was like, wow, that's just a level of casual anti-Semitism I've not encountered ever.
And the different experiences we've all had just listening to everybody's conversations, the different experiences we've all had with Holocaust education is probably radically different. Like we've probably all had different experiences with all different types of history. And whereas, in the areas that Anna and Mara and I grew up in, right? Mara says, I'll echo the idea of not knowing any Jews as being a completely foreign concept to me, right? There are Jews everywhere. And so everybody's got or every other friend has a grandparent or a great grandparent or a great uncle who survived the Shoah, or who knew somebody who survived the Shoah. And so we had them come to our classrooms and tell us their stories every year. Every year we had one or two survivors come into our classrooms, whether at religious school or at public school. Whereas in other communities, there was not, the Holocaust education was something from a book. Whereas with Emma, I was so interested in, I was so interested in what Emma was saying, is that, yes, we learned a lot about the Holocaust because we were in Britain and Nazi Germany was a big thing in our history, right? It was right there. And so Anna's saying that even my non-Jewish parent grew up in a Jewish community. So yes, completely foreign to me for Judaism to be such an outlier. So I think, all right, goodbye, Mara. Thank you for staying so long. But it's just been fascinating to have this class with people who all grew up in different parts of the country, or who have lived in different parts of the country. I know that our numbers are dwindling, but I just want to share one last little bit from Emil Fackenheim. There are a whole bunch of different types of different Holocaust histories or Holocaust theologies that developed after the Shoah. We'll address some of them, some of the impacts of the Shoah actually next week when we talk about Israel. But for now, Professor Emil Fackenheim gives us a charge. He says, there emerges for us a 614th commandment. The Jew today is forbidden to hand Hitler a posthumous victory. We are commanded to survive as Jews lest the Jewish people perish. We are commanded to remember in our very guts and bones the martyrs of the Holocaust lest their memory perish. We are forbidden to deny or despair of God, however much we may have to contend with God and our beliefs lest Judaism perish. We are forbidden to despair of the world as the place which is meant to become the kingdom of God, lest we help make it a meaningless place. And to abandon any of these imperatives in response to Hitler's victories at Auschwitz would be to hand him yet other posthumous victories. So the big question that I have here that I'm leaving us with today is how do we live out this command that Fackenheim is challenging us to uphold? How do we live out in our lives that command not to forget, right? To survive as Jews lest we perish, to remember the people who died in the Holocaust, right? To remember that our world is a positive world, or has the potential to be a positive world, especially the day after yet another one of those devastating shootings, right? Where another reminder of our reality that there are terrible people out there and that there are terrible things that happen. So that's going to be our challenge. We'll start out with that next week. We'll start with this next week, is how do we actually live on Fackenheim's commandments? What do we do?
Tikkun olam.
Tikkun olam. I love that.
I mean, that would be a starting place, but just the word itself with all its meaning. So
yeah, absolutely. It's been lovely learning with you all. I'm so glad you got to join us, Curtis, and I hope I get to see you next week.
Oh, I'll be here. I thoroughly enjoyed it, guys. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
All right. Have a great evening, everyone.
All right. See you guys later.
Okay. Bye.
Bye bye.